to make sure it does not firmly anchor itself with the West, either with, obviously with NATO, to a lesser extent with the EU. Mr. Putin also wants to strengthen his own position at home, and Ukraine now figures prominently in domestic politics. The most interesting speech I've heard in years by any public leader, anywhere, anytime, was Mr. Putin several weeks ago. And what he basically did was something between a vent and a rant. But what you essentially have is 2.5 decades of frustration about the humiliation that Russia has experienced since what it would not acknowledge that it lost the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it all came out. And to some extent, Ukraine is the field by which now this is getting played out. What I think you're not going to see are those 40,000 troops go in. What you're instead seeing is what you might describe as intervention and interference without invasion. So we're not looking at a war, I believe. More broadly, we're not looking at a new Cold War. Russia is 143 million people. Population has been declining. It doesn't have that kind of reach. It doesn't have those kinds of goals. But Mr. Putin is trying to, again, have tremendous lesser extent introduce a new tranche of sanctions against select Russian financial institutions, possibly some of their energy companies. The real question is whether this begins to get Mr. Putin to begin to change the tenor of his behavior, maybe only when he feels it at home. But I would simply say that Russia now, two things, and I'll stop. One is Russia is sufficiently integrated. It's only a $2 trillion economy, but it is sufficiently integrated into the world where sanctions can reach it. And secondly, if sanctions reach them, the blowback of the sanctions will reach us. And by that I mean if the sanctions are sufficiently robust that Russia is heard and begins to influence its policy, it will have an impact on the global economy. You'll see it in Germany, you'll see it in France, you'll see it in particular in Britain, which is the favorite place of certain Russian depositors around the world to keep large deposits in American financial institutions. So in order to achieve some good here, we're also going to have to pay a price, and I don't see any way around it. So,
yeah, I'm pretty much in the same place as Richard. Putin's scaring me, and maybe not for obvious reasons. He's not scaring me because I'm looking on him as more or less bad. He's scaring me because I'm looking on him as the question of whether he's more or less predictable. I think going to Crimea was predictable. He was humiliated, and he was living in a prison of his own making called Sochi, while Yanukovych was being overthrown. And his ability to be robust, even to appear being robust, to continue to back his man was very limited. The games go on. Yanukovych is thrown out. He goes back to Moscow, and as Richard suggests, and Tip O'Neill reinforces, all politics are local. Putin's legitimacy isn't based upon the thriving economy or the resurgence of democracy in the Russian Federation. His legitimacy is based upon the restoration of Russian pride and dealing with historic Russian grievances. And so it was almost automatic, inevitable, that he grabbed the Crimea. As bad as that was, we shouldn't be changing any lines in Europe, anywhere, but particularly in Europe. As bad as that was, that's severable. And I can make a case, and I'll skip over it, but I can make a case that it is thoroughly Russian. Right? So they do that, that's bad, they should be punished for it. They got out of the penalty box far too quickly for similar action in Georgia in 2008 when they grabbed South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But it's a very severable act from that first motorized rifle company crossing the border into eastern Ukraine. So I've been with Richard. Those troops along the border there are table stakes. I think those are the things that make us pay attention to Russian interests, some of which are legitimate, make us pay attention to Russian interests in the Ukraine. So 2 weeks ago, I would have put the chances of a very untoward development there at less than 1 in 10. But the longer this goes, the more the potential I think there is for a black swan event. That something just gets out of hand in Kharkiv or one of those other towns, and that motorized rifle company crosses the border under the pretense of protecting Russian speakers. So I'm still where Richard is. He doesn't want to do this. This would be a bad idea on his part. But I'm now more nervous that he actually be forced or choose to do something against both his interests and ours.
So John, would love to get your perspective on this.
Well, one of the most interesting things that I did in my career, my wife and I were in Moscow, and I was there as the MI6 representative, more or less official representative in Russia, Soviet Union, then Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And for 2.5 years, until they threw me out, I saw the way they reacted to the massive humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union and their loss of control over what had been the Russian Empire. And they were not ready for it. It happened more or less overnight. So there was no psychological preparation for it. And now you see those resentments being expressed much more openly because they feel that they've recovered to some degree and they've got the power to do that. I have tended to think over the years, because I spent a lot of time studying the Soviet brain, that I have a reasonable understanding of the way power politics works and policy works in Russia, because of course it's led by people with that background. Even so, in recent weeks, I have felt maybe I slightly underestimated the degree of emotion involved here. This is a very emotional business. And therefore I am a bit more anxious, maybe, than I might have been, the degree of resentment. In particular, I have to say, it was Mr. Putin, the degree of resentment against the United States. He sees things in zero-sum game terms vis-à-vis the United States. Russia is to be measured in terms of its prestige in relationship to the United States. He's stuck in that mindset. And what is going on now, in his mind, is the United States and its sort of European lackeys interfering in what is Russian territory. I have yet to meet a Russian who thinks Ukraine is a foreign country. And that they just don't. And we have to remember that. Logically and rationally, of course, he will not cross the border with the 40,000 troops. But I don't think we can completely rule it out, whereas I would have done 2 or 3 weeks ago, so I'm rather with Mike Hayden. The other point I'd make quickly is when it comes to sanctions, it's very difficult. This is old-fashioned territorial power politics in Central Eastern Europe. And we haven't really done that since the end of the Cold War, and our resources, particularly in European armed forces, including our own, I'm afraid to say, have greatly reduced. So our ability to push back in purely sort of defence and deterrence terms is greatly reduced, and we look at economic sanctions instead. I am not sure we really understand what the likely consequences of the sanctions will be.
Do you agree with the view that the battle of Ukraine could be the greatest challenge that Europe has faced in a generation?
Well, I think we have to be careful before we talk about greatest challenges here or there, and I've seen quite a few challenges. And if we remember what happened in the Balkans in the 1990s, that was a pretty big challenge for Europe. But undoubtedly, we do now face the prospect of the reappearance of that kind of old territorial power politics in Europe, which we thought we got away from. And we've got to think through the consequences of that.
I'll give a different answer to that. I actually think the biggest challenge facing Europe is Europe. Russia is not going to challenge core Europe. It's going to happen on the periphery. The Eurozone crisis is not the biggest problem facing Europe. The biggest crisis facing Europe is not a crisis, but it's condition. And it's that the natural growth rate of Europe is almost non-existent. And that's because very few of the prerequisites are in place for Europe to grow at a robust level, and I simply don't see that changing. So my guess is that, if you will, European share of global output is between 20 and 25%. It is going down and down and down, and that is inexorable, and Europe's role in the world will also begin to contract over time. The European era and the Atlantic era, if you will, of centrality to history, I think have largely been passed. We're going to talk about Asia in a minute, but the biggest challenge I would say facing Europe is essentially what is and what is not going on within European societies.
There's a subset of that for the Ukraine. We're going to sanction you put NATO troops in Poland and in the Baltic to dissuade the Russians. The action we could take with the single greatest effect would be to help the Ukrainians build a functioning government, something that they have not had since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It is the creation of civil society in the Ukraine that keeps this situation more stable than anything else we could do.
You're already losing control. So John, did you have a...
Well, I was just going to make, I'm going to say, a rather sort of national point in response to what Richard said there. Of course, as a British former official, I can't speak as a European. But I would point out that our own growth rate and prospects are not quite the same as in the Eurozone.
Can we talk quickly about U.S. credibility around the world? You've written about this here, whether it was the big red line that the president had put out around Syria. Can you talk a little about the perceived structural decline of our leadership role?
I think there's two reasons that have led to it, and there's one real consequence. One is that there's been a gap between foreign policy pronouncements and foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
And any time you create a gap between what you say you're going to do and what you do, you create an issue. And we've done it in Syria. We've done it elsewhere. The other big problem for the United States around the world has nothing to do with the State Department or the Pentagon. It has to do with Congress and the White House. And it is the truth. Mike just talked about the dysfunctionality of Ukraine politics. Well, our own dysfunctionalities can be world-class too. And we've seen it with the sequester, which is really dumb public policy. We've seen it with the government shutdown. We've seen it with the near default on American debt. We've seen it with the inability to deal with entitlements. James was right. Our medium-term economic prospects are good in this country. The big, big cloud over this country in the long term is called entitlements. Nothing has been touched. And as the baby boomers get older, just look at what happens to Medicare and Social Security costs starting in around 2020. It is the big cloud again over the future of economic reforms. We can't pass comprehensive immigration reform. Joe Biden got in trouble for describing LaGuardia as third world. It should be third world. That would be much better. Many of you travel around the world. Our infrastructure is not even up to that. So, the biggest actual problem I think facing us around the world in terms of our credibility is the example. We are saying the danger with all of that, and it gets back to things like whether you're looking at the Middle East or looking at Ukraine, is the world is not some self-organizing, wonderful place. It's not Adam Smith's marketplace. There's no invisible hand out there making it all work. And without, at times, the quite visible hand of the United States, not acting unilaterally, but working with our traditional partners in Europe and in Asia in particular, without the United States able and willing to play that role, the world begins to deteriorate. And the most likely course of action then over the next 5 to 10 years is something, it's not a switch, but it's more of a dial. It is a messier world.
General Hayes, you want to...
Yeah, along the same lines.